I have collected, since 2019, I've collected every media news report of a search and rescue event in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. So Fish and Game puts out a media report. I'm basically grabbing like the mountain, the trail, the month, the date, whether or not the person was in a group or not in a group, the day of the week, and then sort of I'm categorizing the type of rescue that it was, and then making some assumptions around negligence or not negligence based on the report. I used to call the rating shame, no shame. I've softened up over the years, and I'm trying to get a little bit more professional in my rating. So the shame, no shame has now moved to negligent, not negligent. So I'm trying to be a little more professional here. But this is not all encompassing, because there are search and rescues that are done that aren't published in the newspaper. There's a number of walkouts and things like that that happen that we're just not privy to. But in general, New Hampshire does a pretty good job about publicizing all of their search and rescue activities. So this is a good way for us to take a look at volume as well as some interesting trends. And as I go through this, I'm actually going to make some recommendations to the powers that be in New Hampshire, whether it's Fish and Game or the various clubs and things like that. I think there's a couple of things that they could do to tweak the messaging and maybe help lower the number of search and rescues. But we'll go through this, and you guys just jump in whenever you have any questions, and I'll share this in the show notes as well so everyone can look at it. I have actually published this on Reddit, on the White Mountain Reddit subreddit, so people can check it out. But as far as the overall media reports go, from 2019 to 2022, it's been pretty consistent. We had like in the low to mid 90s for the last 3 years. 2022 we had 102, so it's been mostly between 95 and 102 search and rescue events. And then as far as those events, it usually, because there are events where there's multiple people that need to be rescued, we typically see around 110 to 120 people that are involved in search and rescue events. So it's pretty consistent, Stomp, over the years. And you see spikes, and there's some interesting things around here about how month to month we have some weirdness. So I don't think there's any way for Fish and Game to look at this data to say, like, okay, we can predict volume, because it just seems like a lot of this stuff is unpredictable. But month over month, you can kind of get averages. But one thing that is interesting is I have a list here of what we call the top 10 list for hotspots as well as visitors. So this is
That's handy.
What's that?
That's handy.
Yeah, exactly. So this sort of is over the last 4 years. When we look at the busiest mountains and regions for search and rescues, Franconia Ridge comes in at number 1 with 48 rescues, which I think is around 10% of the overall search and rescue events. And then Mount Washington comes in second with 42 events. And Franconia Ridge, anything that's Falling Waters to Old Bridle to the Ridge is basically, I don't categorize Lafayette and Lincoln separately, just because that region is it's easy to cluster it together. But it's Franconia Ridge, Mount Washington, Mount Chicora, Monadnock, and then it drops off pretty significantly. But you've got Cannon, Welsh Dickey, Mount Major, Garfield, Moosilauke, and Liberty. And they all, I think the common theme here is that most of these are in the most accessible areas of the White Mountains. So you can park right on Franconia Ridge and get up there. Mount Washington's accessible. Chicora is very accessible. Monadnock, no surprises here, but Welsh Dickey. And
I'm surprised Major isn't higher.
Yeah.
Oh, that's true.
Yeah, and I suspect with Mount Major there's probably a lot of rescues that are handled by maybe local police they don't make the paper. But you're right. I bet you there are a lot more in Mount Major that we don't see.
The Fredwoods.
Yeah, but the nice thing about this is when you look at these hotspots, almost all of them are covered by the Trailhead Steward program. So there are trailhead stewards, set up at Franconia and Mount Washington and Mount Chicora. Monadnock has its own Fish and Game hut down below, but for the most part, they get it pretty well covered. And then this is always an interesting sort of debate is there's this sort of idea that Massachusetts people come up to New Hampshire and need to be rescued more frequently. That is true, but it's pretty close. It's almost 50-50 between Mass and New Hampshire. So I think it's surprising.
Vermonters must be doing something right, huh?
What's that?
Look at the Vermonters. They must be doing something right.
Yeah, the Vermonters. I mean, the right thing they're doing is they're sticking with their own state. They're not dealing with the crowds, I bet. So, this next one here, and I know this will be a little bit small for you guys to follow along in the share window here, but this is basically a month-to-month overview of when search and rescues happen. So not too surprising, like July and August tend to be the busiest months, but surprisingly, October during foliage season is pretty busy. But the thing that stands out to me is that every year we have an anomaly with a month that has a big spike above its average. So for example, if you look at November of 2019, May of 2019, you will see this big spike here where, we had 13 rescues where the previous years we had like 4 in 2020, which is probably due to COVID, but then even in May in 2021 was pretty low. And then we had a big spike in 2020, which was in November. And then in 2021, this is probably the most interesting one, we had a huge spike of search and rescue events in January. And then in 2022, we saw August blew up, and then also September. So it's very tough to predict the volume, but you can sort of work to the averages and kind of know that, May is when things are going to start picking up, and then June and July will be steady but not high volume, and then August, September, and October will be busy.
Interesting. I wonder if it depends upon weather trends too. I seem to recall last year was a pretty warm and rainy, and just sort of an odd year for winter.
Yeah, and sometimes these numbers can be skewed as well. If you have one rescue that might have 6 or 7 people involved in it, then it can skew the numbers a little bit too, because this is just based on the number of people rescued.
Yeah, gotcha.
This next one here is category. So again, I know that this is hard for you guys to see, and it's a little bit small on our screen. But on the left-hand side is the biggest volume of search and rescue categories, which is the lower leg injury. So you can see, we're in the low 40s every year, and then this year spiked up to 54. The next most common category is people lost because of headlamp or map, or they're just generally panicking. And the interesting thing with this data here is you can see in 2022, we saw a significant drop over the average when it comes to headlamp calls, and we saw a significant increase in lower leg injuries. So I don't know if the headlamp calls were just due to more education, or if it was due to trailhead stewards making sure that people had headlamps, or if there was other things going on here. But you can sort of see the headlamp issues have dissipated a little bit in 2022, whereas the lower leg injuries have increased. So I think whatever they've done to sort of mitigate the headlamp piece of it has worked. I have a theory, Stomp, and Jack and Ben, maybe you can verify this or get this thoughts, but I have a theory that what may be happening is that the technology with 911 GPS positioning may be such that the calls that they're getting for lost headlamp, maybe they are assessing the weather conditions, getting the GPS information, and then telling people to stay out overnight until it gets light, as long as they're identifying they're on the trail. Maybe they're just getting more comfortable doing that if they get the GPS coordinates on a 911 call. I don't know.
Could be.
Yeah, it could be.
Yeah. I definitely know there's been a boom in the no response calls where somebody calls in and they just guide them off trail or back onto trail, or get them to a safe location and say, okay, we'll see you in the morning. There's definitely been a blow up in that number.
Yep. Yeah. So again, lower leg injuries is the most common category. Lost headlamp, map, panic is the next one. We've got miscellaneous injuries, which is basically anything that's not a lower leg injury, if it's a knee or a head or an elbow or whatever. Then in all these categories, besides the headlamp and the lower leg injury, they're all pretty low and pretty consistent. But miscellaneous injury, reckless behavior, we've seen a drop in the number of reckless behavior search and rescues this year. Fatigue, fatalities, and then medical issues. They're all pretty much on the average of like around 10 per year. So those are all the categories. Like I said, the thing that stands out to me is big increase in lower leg injuries this year, big decrease in headlamp issues. So whatever is happening with the headlamp situation seems to be helping out, but we seem to be getting worse with slip and falls. When it comes to age range here, this is, let me put this in slideshow. Maybe this will help you guys see it a little bit better.
Oh,
yeah, there we go. And I can just wing my notes here, but you can see sort of lower, the younger people tend to have a much bigger issue with search and rescue. I think Stomp, we talked about this a couple of times around the young people that got into trouble the last couple of months, a couple of fatalities. Like, I don't know how we get the message out to young people around safety, but clearly these numbers show that, if you're 20 to 29 or a younger person than that, like, your risk of being involved in a search and rescue is much higher.
Yeah, well, it's an open question.
Yeah. Interestingly, there's a one anomaly here that I called out, which is, there's a couple of anomalies. In 2021, we saw a big spike in 60 to 69-year-olds needing search and rescues. And then we've also seen for the last 2 years, 70 plus, we've seen a lot of search and rescues over the last 2 years with them. We had 5 in 2019, 1 in 2020, and then the last 2 years we have 19 search and rescues involving 70-year-old or older. So the old people are misbehaving.
Myself. Yeah, absolutely. Just anecdotally, I've seen it.
Yep. And then as far as gender and age range goes, you can see here it's pretty even across the genders. The only sort of interesting trend here is when you get up into the so basically the number of search and rescues is a little bit of it's pretty even between the under 29 and younger set, even actually under 39. When you get to 40-year-old, in the 40-year-old range, females are a little bit more likely for search and rescues. Then it evens out again when they get into the 50s. When you get into the 60s, there's a significant, almost a 3x increase in the or a 2x increase in the likelihood of search and rescue calls. So those 19 females involved in search and rescues over the last 4 years compared to 43 in the 60 to 69-year-old bracket. I have a theory about this one, Stomp. You can tell me what you think, Jack and Ben. I think that men tend to overestimate their physical capability for a longer period of time. I think women are much more realistic about their ability, and I think there's a lot of old dudes that aren't able to give it up, and they get out there and they're like, I got an issue.
That's too funny.
That sounds likely.
Yeah. The next one here is just a rating between negligent versus not negligent. You can see the blue here are the negligent calls over the last 4 years. So you can see no age group is that bad when it comes to negligence, except for the 20-something-year-olds, definitely more likely to be in a situation where they've got, and negligence generally I rank them by if they didn't have a headlamp or they did something clearly reckless, being somewhere they weren't supposed to be, or Fish and Game calls it out in their report saying that the people were grossly not prepared. So, but you can see here, in most cases, it's just sort of things happen and it is what it is. But in the 20-somethings, they do tend to have some issues with negligence. And just so that everyone's aware, anytime there's a fatality, I take that out of the negligence rating. So those are not involved in this. This is only people that were involved in non-fatal. And then this is just year over year. You can see, I think the reason why you'll see in 2019, 2020, you can see the negligent calls have gone down significantly, and I think that that's primarily due to the sharp decrease in headlamp calls. Typically I would say, if you didn't have a headlamp and you got caught out on dark, that's on you. I guess you could argue that, like, look, I had a headlamp, but the battery or something broke, but still, I think that we've seen a big decrease in the last, 2 years in the number of sort of grossly negligent cases.
Nice work.
And then seasonally, you can see, basically, I've got a slide here that just goes from fall, spring, summer, and winter. Summer by far has the most search and rescue events. Fall and spring are pretty much even, and then winter has around 20 to 25 search and rescue events over the last 4 years. Day of the week. So this is another one that sort of breaks it down. No surprises here. Saturday and Sunday are the busiest. Monday is the busiest weekday. And then Tuesday and Wednesday, actually Friday's the slowest with the least amount of search and rescue calls. And then Thursday's a little heavier. But generally Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday are the slowest days for search and rescue. So if you don't want to get involved in a call, go out on those 3 days.
Yeah, copy that.
Yeah. And interestingly, Tuesday on Mount Washington there's never been a search and rescue call in the last 4 years on a Tuesday on Mount Washington. So if you're going to hike in the summertime on Mount Washington, go on a Tuesday. So your odds will be in your favor.
Huh.
So,
very strange.
And I think Fridays are very common rescue days for Franconia Ridge for some reason. I don't know why.
Really? You saw that data?
Yeah, I have that data broken down. Like I don't have it in these slides, but I have data that shows for each mountain what the volume is per day. I mean, you just run it as a pivot table.
Gotcha. Interesting.
This is an interesting one here. So I started collecting in 2021 and 2022. There was a lot of discussion on different message boards around whether or not you were more likely to get in trouble as a solo hiker. So you hear this all the time, like, hey, you shouldn't hike solo because you're more likely to get in trouble and get in a rescue or whatever. It's actually about 3x times more likely that when you're in a group, you're going to need a rescue. So 160 search and rescue calls with people that were in a group, which means they were with one or more people. And then there were 49 events that were with solo hikers. So
I wonder how many solo hikers self-rescued. Generally,
I don't know.
You're usually more experienced when you go solo. I mean, I'm not saying that's 100% true, but maybe they self-rescue more.
Well, here's another one. How about bushwhackers versus on-trail people? I mean,
that'd be interesting.
Rarely hear about a bushwhacker.
Yeah, it's pretty rare that you hear about a bushwhack. It's pretty rare that you hear about an AT thru hiker. But occasionally you will hear one, but not too often. And then this is the breakdown with fatalities. I know this is 4 slides here, but essentially, I've got 4 ways to look at this. Like, were they in a group or were they solo? This is where it gets interesting. Is that yes. In general, you're more likely to be in a search and rescue when you're in a group. When it comes to the fatalities, I think there was 9 fatalities over the last 4 years where I actually only collected 2021 and 2022. I didn't do 2019 and 2020, but 9 of the fatalities were solo hikers, and then I think 6 or 7 were in a group. So I think that when things get really bad and you're solo, that's where it can be an issue for sure. And then just seasonally, it's pretty much proportional to what you see for search and rescue events over season. Age range, it's the 50 to 59 and 60 to 69 year old age range that is the most likely to experience a fatality. And then from a gender perspective, significantly male over female. I think 25 25 male fatalities on the trail for the last 4 years, and there's actually 4 female fatalities.
That doesn't surprise me. I think in most things you'll see it, that kind of proportion. Have you ever heard a woman say, "Hold my beer"?
No. And I also think, and this is something that I've been thinking about a little bit, Jack, is I don't know how many of these have been, heart attacks. Like there's definitely a number of them that are hypothermia and hiking related, but there's also a fair number that are medical issues, heart attacks, things like that. I think that there's something to be said, especially if you're a solo hiker. There's a service that I will link to in the show notes, but I think preventative cardiology is something that everybody, once you get to be 50 years old, I think going to get your carotid artery ultrasound done and some of that preventative maintenance, I forget what it's called. I think it's Lifeline Cardiology Scan. These places where you can go for $180 to get your artery scan through ultrasound, and they'll give you an assessment on the plaque buildup inside your arteries. I think that's worth it for people to do on every 2-3 years, aside from your normal stress test that you'll be doing, just on the off chance that they catch something. I mean, you don't want to be out there hiking and find out that you've got a blocked artery that's 99%. Like, it's game over if you're by yourself. So I think preventative cardiology is something that if you're going to be hiking solo or even hiking in a group, if you're like a 50 years or older men, then you should be thinking about this preventative cardiology.
I had an episode with a friend of mine a number of years ago where we were going to hike in the winter, and it was one of the road closures. We stopped walking down the road, and he's kind of like holding onto his chest. He's like, just give me a minute. It comes and goes. After 3 times, I said, that's it. We're going back to the car. You're going to go home, and tomorrow you're going to the doctor. And to come to find out, he had what they call a widowmaker. Like 98% blockage. I mean, we were in a spot where there was no cell service, no nothing. If he had collapsed on the trail, I would have had to leave him there to go find a cell service. And I fully agree with what you said about the preventative, cardiac care.
Yeah, it's crazy. My father, the same thing. He went in for a routine stress test, and he was 99% blocked. They had him on the surgery table like 6 hours later.
Wow.
So, yeah. So it's something to be said. But a couple of recommendations that I have are, again, that preventative cardiology work. I definitely recommend that. I think there's an opportunity. I go back to this lower leg injury thing. I think that there's an opportunity for Fish and Game or anybody that's in a position of power to start updating the message around. I think that we need to get splints as a 10 essential. I think that there's an opportunity there with the volume of lower leg injuries that you see out in the trail. Educating people on the use of splints and getting them sort of into the mindset to say, like, if I get a lower leg injury, I'm going to try to splint this myself and see if I can power my way out of there. Obviously, if you've got a broken ankle or something, you got to call for search and rescue. Don't hesitate. But I do think that there's an opportunity here, whether it's through like billboards or the organizations that push out the 10 essentials. I think publicizing field splints as an option you should be carrying is something that they should seriously consider, because it's the biggest volume of rescues. And I think that there's of those 50 plus lower leg injuries that happened this year, I got to imagine there's a percentage of them that could have been self-rescue if people had a field splint available to them.
I don't carry a field splint, but I do carry what's the elastic stuff you can wrap around an injury?
Yeah, like I forget what it's called too.
Yeah. It's late in the evening right now, and my brain's not working the way it's supposed to be. But I carry that. But I think the splint idea is a really good idea.
Yeah. So I
have
think.
You ever considered contacting Fish and Game, like the Colonel, and just saying, "Hey, I have some neat data. Be cool to bounce their numbers off of yours, because these numbers are pretty intense."
Yeah. I mean, it's maybe I will do that.
You should.
Yeah. Send it over to them. But there's a couple of other things that I haven't pulled. One of which that I do need to get to at some point. It's just I don't have time. Is I'd like to start collecting the time that the call came in and the time that the person made it to the trailhead, because I think that data is in there, just to get a sense of what the typical turnaround time is. A couple of other things I have collected is, was there a helicopter involved or not? I started doing that this year. There was like 17 events that involved a helicopter. I've started to take notes on whether or not people had a hike safe card. I think there was like 4 events last year where people had a hike safe card.
Do you track weather conditions though?
Nothing on weather conditions. That would be interesting to see whether there was visibility or not. But the other thing that I did capture was whether or not there was an outside agency that assisted with a rescue. So there's like 2 or 3 examples of, matter of fact, there's I think 3 examples of the COG stepping in and helping out with a rescue. There's probably like 6 or 7 examples of AMC crew huts or hut crews stepping in to help out with rescues as well. So there's
The
a
solo
lot that
solo
goes on.
guys, when they're going for the classes, they've been called out before.
Yeah,
Oh,
I didn't
yeah.
even capture that, but you're right. And it's when the solo classes happen, so do the search and rescue calls. It seems like.
Yeah.
So, but there's a lot of data in
Have
here.
you ever thought of
and
going on the road and presenting this to, like, I know a lot of the search and rescue groups will do presentations, but maybe you could hook up with some of them and just kind of share that data with the public. I mean, this is good stuff.
Yeah. I mean, I'm always open to talking to anybody, but I'm going to share this in the show notes, and then, the last couple of slides I have here are just unresolved criminal cases. So we've talked about a lot of these. Sherry Roth from 1977. There was I think she was strangled to death in Sawyer Brook Trail. Pamela Webb was somebody that had been found murdered in 1989. Louisa Putt, well-known case that was in the vicinity of Glen Ellis Falls. Patrick McCarthy was a young boy that died suspiciously on Whaleback Mountain, and then Maura Murray we've talked about before. And there's a number of missing people that have also never been found. Kevin Race was a gentleman from Maine that disappeared mysteriously. Gentleman was scheduled to go to court on felony embezzlement charges. Wrote a note saying he was going to Mount Washington to end his life, but people seem to think that he may have just moved to the Caribbean. Stefan Pori Sue, we've talked about him before. Michael Miller, missing on Franconia Ridge from 1983, we've talked about him. And then a couple of noteworthy arrests of different people. So interesting stuff here. I'll share it with the listeners, and it's good to sort of look through this data. Maybe someone will pick something off that I didn't see, but I do think that the biggest opportunity out of this is to just remind people preventative cardiac steps that you can take, and then start thinking about that splint, and then whatever's being done to limit the headlamp stuff, keep it up because it's working.
Good information.
Yeah.
Very good. Nice work.
Yeah, and I think, Stomp, we've run out of time, so we're going to have to push the recent search and rescue news to the next episode.
Yeah, actually, let's just do one because it sort of ties in with the imagery and searching from above, and it's just freezing hikers in Zion found by thermal imagery. So we'll just give you the link so you can check it out. It's really neat because it actually shows you the actual video that the people up above were seeing as they found these hikers that were trapped in Zion. So it's really cool. So definitely check that out in the show notes. And other than that, everything else is just snowmobile crashes into trees, rocks, and throttling when you shouldn't be throttling. So nothing, you're not missing anything. There haven't really been any calls.
Excellent. So, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us, and we will see you next week.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You bet.
Yeah.